Hello and welcome to polyplane.com. Today we're going to be talking about the patch tool. The last few weeks we've been talking about different types of surface generations, be it lofting or sweeps or sweep 2. We're getting to a point now where we're starting to understand how boundaries of surfaces kind of work together and really what you can do with them. Now, before I do the patch tool, I want to show you something kind of neat. This command is called Untrim. So if I type Untrim, and I have my surface here and I click on an edge to untrim, it will remember what that surface looked like. It works best on a hole that isn't touching an edge. So if I were to trim away this edge right here and then type untrim, what'll happen is it'll remember all of the trims that happened on the outer edge of this surface and bring it back to its original state. Well, I don't really want that. I kind of want the little dip going on. So at that point, if I really wanted to just undo that surface, I would have to undo it within that step of me doing it. So I type trim, I trim that away, and I'm like, oh, I don't want that trimmed. I can only hit Control Z because if I untrim the whole thing, I'll completely untrim and I'll have to go back and put this scoop in. We want to just be aware of that. The reason I bring this up is because a lot of times you'll have a hole in a surface and you won't really know what to do with it. You might be designing on the fly and you'll have your hole here and you're like, well, I could cap that off or whatever. So you'd untrim it, but there's another way to do it, and that's where I bring in the patch tool. So with the patch tool, you're really wanting to fill the hole with some sort of surface, and for that surface to work, you have to define some guidelines. So the first thing you want to do is define the outer edge. Now, a quick way to do this, now I've got my curve here. I'm going to delete that curve and I'm going to type dupe edge. That's D-U-P-E-D-G-E. And click on that edge. And it'll generate a curve off of that. And I can then snap some curves to that and use that to generate the patch surface. So if I type patch, it's going to bring up this prompt. And you've got quite a bit of options here. What I want to do is focus on the U and V spans and the stiffness. We're not going to really worry about anything else here. So I'm going to click preview with what I've got so far. And you can immediately see the surface is fitting itself within the constraints that I've defined by those curves. Now the cool thing about the patch tool is you can have as many of these rib sections, if you will, these cross-section curves that I've drawn in here. You can have as many as you want going in either direction. The more you have, the higher this surface U and V span I recommend being. So if you had like 30 lines going in each direction, it might be a good idea to increase these, because the surface U spans and surface V spans, those are essentially the surface resolution ISO lines. So if I hit OK, and I've got this surface here, and I turn on the points for that surface, you can see what the surface actually looks like. There's these points that are out here, and those are actually part of a trim. So if I undo that and I redo it, and let's bring the span up to like 20, and hit OK. See, now the resolution's much higher, but because there's only a couple of guidelines indicating what that surface is, it can only fill that space with that much data. So that's why what I want to do is keep that number nice and low. So I'll select my points and my curves here, and you're back to, where you want it to be. Now the cool thing is I can take these and join them and then fill them, look nice and smooth, and that's really cool. And you can do this on pretty much any surface. One thing about this is the example here I'm showing is it's really rudimentary. It's a symmetrical hole on a surface, which is very much what Rhino offers in their help book. So what I wanted to do was show you something a little more dynamic. Okay, so what we've got here is a hole on a surface, but it's a lot more complicated. It's an asymmetrical hole. It has multiple cross sections. What I really want to show you here is how the patch tool uses the curves that you input to really generate your ultimate curve. So what I did was I trimmed out a curve out of a surface here. I've got all my curves drawn, and what I'm going to do is type patch again, and let's preview what this makes. Okay, now that you can see how that that really, it's taking the input curves that I've given it and it's generating a surface through that. It's working the same. So you can really see how the value of this really starts to come into play, creating surfaces to fill holes essentially. I'm going to increase the resolution on this just a little bit. Preview that. Yeah, it gives me a little more detail. And click OK. So I can fillet an edge on here and essentially do the same thing. So yeah, that looks pretty cool. And you can do a lot of cool little surface details like this that are a little more controlled than just, you know, booleaning out an object and then softening the edges. So the final example that I want to give you of the patch tool is actually patching the ends of a surface, which this is a little more complicated, but it's often what needs to happen. So what I've got here is this form that I did with a 2-rail sweep. I'll hide that for a sec so you can see the rails. There's 2 rails, and then I've got these cross sections here that built the form. But when you sweep, like I was saying last week, let me get rid of these. When you do a sweep like this, you're left with 2 open ends, unless you're making like half a symmetrical form, in which case you can just mirror it over and join the 2 and be done. But here it's a little more complicated because I want to cap off these ends, but I don't want to just, you know, I can take this and type cap, but that's going to give me this flat edge. And yeah, I can fillet that over, but what would work more for me is if I could control that surface just a little bit more. So like in the other 2 examples, you want to have an edge and then you want to have some cross-section wires that really define that. So if I select all those and type patch, yeah, see, that's much better. And then I can take that and join it and fillet the edge. I'll do those. Look at that. That gives me a nice clean surface. It's a little more dynamic, and you know, it has a lot more character to it. So that's one end. So what about this end? If I'm looking at it, the wires are a little more complicated here because my sweep created this round edge here, so I'm really having to kind of finish off the work of the sweep command using some additional wires. So I've got my curves, and I'm going to type patch again. And you want to have a minimum of 2 rails, one going up and down and the other left to right. And the reason this is if I were to just patch it like this and hit OK, what you'll see happen is, because there's no data, I didn't grab that other rail, it kind of flattens out right here. And that might be what you're looking for, but by giving it that second rail, you're really giving it a little bit more information. So, you know, your surface will be a little more accurate. So I'll type patch, grab my curve cross sections here and hit enter. And we're going to make the span of this a little bit higher, 10 by 10, and the stiffness 1. Now what stiffness does is it pulls the surface closer and closer to your control curves. So if I did like a stiffness of 100, what that's going to do is it's going to almost make it, you know, totally flat, because you got to think about it as a piece of fabric, hence the name patch. So if you want really, really loose fabric, you know, doing 0.5, which is where I usually keep it, will give you a much, you know, softer surface that really follows the rails that you input and allows a little more control. I think that looks good. Now, if I render preview this, you're going to see it's not joined, so we want to join those. That one looks pretty good, and render that. That's a little bit soft, and I could go back and, you know, adjust the curves a little bit to get that match even closer. And what you can do is you can use the match curve command when you're generating your initial curves. But that looks pretty good, especially from way out here where you're not really going to be seeing that. So it takes a little bit of finessing, but you can start to patch off your caps. I mean, like this one looks really great, but again, that geometry is pretty simple. When you start to get into like really complex surfaces like this area here, the blending can be a little bit challenging. So it's a little bit give and take, but yeah. So those are applications for the patch tool. Next week, we're going to finish up this surfacing series with the network surface tool. That's like the big daddy of all surfacing tools. It's definitely the most powerful. So stay tuned for that. All right. Thanks so much for watching, and have a great day.